confident that we are succeeding in experiencing a significant decline of Omicron cases in our state, and this will allow us in the upcoming weeks to take further steps forward in regaining a more normal life in the state of Washington while still protecting our public health and our families' health.
Governor Jay Inslee right there talking about mask mandates, vaccine mandates. Well, we're going to see some of those measures start lifting here in the month of March. We're also going to see if Seattle's eviction moratorium for residential and commercial properties, we're going to see that end this month. And also the Seattle City Council talking about hiring bonuses for police officers. Well, guess what? We're covering all that and more on this episode of Seattle News, Views, and Brews, your coffee break political podcast. I'm Brian Callanan. I'm a host on Seattle Channel. The views expressed here are my own, and I am joined by David Croman of the Seattle Times. David, great to see you here. I wanted to ask, are we going to have opening day of baseball on March 31st? Can we get this labor dispute figured out? What's your magic 8-ball telling you on this?
It seems like probably not.
Yeah.
I think this weekend was sort of the last chance for them to get an agreement in time to not have days canceled. So yeah, it seems unlikely at this point.
I was hoping that you'd have some sort of magic news for me, but perhaps not.
No, I don't.
David usually has the answers to everything, so I just thought I'd point that out. Thank you, David, as always, for joining me. And thanks also to our patrons. If you are a listener and not a patron, please do consider supporting the show on Patreon. You can join the Mug Club at the $10 level and get your very own Seattle News, Views, and Brews coffee mug. And our Mug Club members are featured on our Mug Shot of the Week. And this week, the return of intern Rob. David, he is a big fan of your work, as you can see here. Check it out. The Welcome David sign, the miniature bus, a tip of the cap to your work on transportation. I know you've received a lot of honors in your career here, David, but I think this one is right up there, wouldn't you say?
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah,
thanks,
big
Rob.
thanks. Big thanks out to Rob. Thanks for doing that. And folks, do support the show. Seattle News, Views, and Brews is on Patreon, and we're also on Converge Media too. Check out the video version of the podcast on Converge Wednesday nights at 7. All right, off we go with right here, right now. All right, well, we're going to get started with the Seattle City Council's agenda for the beginning of March, and a ton happening here. We got the Transportation Committee talking about an audit of Seattle's sidewalk maintenance and repair program. That should be a whole ton of fun. The full council's talking about delaying its heating oil tax increase. Very interesting story there. But I wanted to focus, David, on something the council is doing this week here, retroactively authorizing a hiring bonus program for police officers and 911 dispatchers for the month of January. Little backstory here, folks. This was the program that the council and former Mayor Durkin were fighting over. The council passed a measure saying, okay, we're going to pay this, but this program ends at the end of 2021. The mayor pushed back, actually told the police department, keep handing out those bonuses, which they did to the tune of about $220,000 in January. The council became aware of this. Mayor Harrell became aware of this. And so we're talking about a retroactive payback this week. David, I'm interested in all of this because I'm wondering what the council's next move is. Will they consider more bonuses like this? Because we had that report last week to the council that showed the SPD has lost 350 officers over the past 2 years.
Mm-hmm. And there has been a sort of turn. Obviously a couple years ago after the protests, we heard a lot of talk about alternatives to policing, even some people wanting to cut the police department by 50%. But then, the departures from the Seattle Police Department happened a lot more precipitously and quickly than even the members on the council who had kind of supported some reductions in funding. And so I think, we are still seeing some sort of effort to claw some of those reductions back. And I think the last election was probably very informative to some members of the council, where, conversation about defund the police was really not popular on the ballot, combined with, increases in violent crime. I mean, it's clear that this city hall is more interested in kind of getting back some of the police officers that were lost than maybe previous city halls had been.
Fair enough. And I guess in looking at this, it was also interesting to look at the Public Safety Committee checking this out last week. The SPD is projecting it's going to hire 125 officers this year, which is a substantial number, but it's also projecting 125 officers will separate from the SPD, meaning leaving the department. It's just really difficult, David, I think, to talk about bringing in more officers when the department is losing so many. It's such a quick clip. It seems.
Yeah, it's just the competition is really intense too. I mean, a
Hmm.
lot of
For any
departments
job,
are.
yeah. Hmm.
Yeah, exactly. And really for police officers too. And
Yeah.
police departments really love hiring police officers from other departments because
Hmm.
it saves them a lot of time and money
Yep.
that would otherwise be spent on training
Hmm.
and going through the academy and things like that. And so
Yeah.
that's why we get these sort of bidding wars with these bonuses where
Right.
neighboring jurisdictions, are offering 10, 15.
Yeah.
I think at one
King
point I'd
County
seen it.
Sheriff's is doing 15. Right. Hmm.
Right. I think I've seen some places that were like almost as high as 25, and that's how
Mm,
much money they stand to save if they can convince an experienced or not even, even a 2 or 3 year
sure.
police officer to come over. And so,
Hmm.
um, I mean, I think it's some combination of lingering frustration and dissatisfaction from officers with City Hall. But
Sure.
then also, I imagine the opportunities elsewhere are going to continue to play a big role in that of people
Yeah.
leaving.
It's interesting too to see how police are being deployed right now, David, because another part of this public safety committee meeting from last week was talking about how officers now are going to hotspots. 12th and Jackson was brought up, that place that has had so many businesses shut down because of open air markets involved with stolen goods there. So it looks like there's a focus now, maybe a little too late for some of those businesses, but a focus now on cleaning up some of that activity. But I think still the concern of where's that activity going? Can we take the conversation that next level here in terms of what policing is going to be looking like over the next couple months with regard to the officers that are there and the officers that might come on?
Yeah, right. I mean, hotspot policing is an old method
Nothing new.
of
Yeah.
addressing sort of concern areas.
Hmm.
Yeah, I think the kind of biggest example was the 9.5 block strategy when Ed Murray was the mayor.
Hmm.
But then, under Mayor Durkin too, they did some hotspot policing in downtown and Westlake, and now we're seeing it again in Little Saigon. So it is, yeah, it is not a new strategy. And I think some question about, like you said, where do those people go? The 12th
Hmm.
and Jackson Street. Hearing praise that it is much less busy than it was before, but also
Sure.
reports that there's another kind of version of this cropping up on King Street just down the
Yep.
road. And so,
Hmm.
um, I think it's something that if a new mayor, for example,
Hmm.
wants to show that they're taking an interest in an issue or a neighborhood, it is.
Yeah.
Um, it does make a difference in the short term for sure, but
Sure.
I think there are still a lot of questions about what it means long term.
Absolutely. And the council's looking into this, folks. They're talking about getting a report on the impact of these crimes downtown and hopefully getting to the root of it where they can find the organizations that are sending these people out to rob these different places. So, a lot cooking with this one. We'll keep an eye on it. Thanks for your insight there, David. I wanted to move on to another story, though, a big one this week. March 1st, bars, restaurants, gyms, other indoor spaces in our state will no longer be required to check for vaccination status or a negative test. David, just looking at this broadly, do you see this as a moment of relief or a moment of concern? What are your thoughts?
Well, I'm sure it depends on who you ask. I'm sure
Yeah.
some people are concerned, but I think King County has a really high rate of
Hmm.
vaccinations. We do know that uh, these mandates have put the onus of policing them on the
Yeah.
restaurants and the
Hmm.
people up front, which I think is has been challenging. That said, I think it I personally, when I go into a restaurant or have, it's sort of comforting knowing that everybody
Hmm.
around me is vaccinated. But
Yeah. And they're
at
checking.
this
Sure.
point,
Hmm.
y- right. But I mean, I think the conversation around rolling back a lot of these requirements is moving ahead full steam. The CDC
Hmm.
is endorsing some of these changes,
Right.
starting to, and case counts are a lot lower. And so, I think you don't hear a lot of debate about whether or not a vaccine mandate should ever go away. I mean, most
Right.
folks assume it will eventually, and so really
Hmm.
the debate we're having is one of timing. Is now the right time to do it?
Right.
And that kind of defines the response to the pandemic through the last 2 years. Is
Right.
this just the right time?
Hmm.
Um, y- you know, and so yeah, I mean, I wouldn't say it's a surprise. I mean, we're seeing this across the country. These
Right. Right.
vaccine and test mandates being lifted.
Yeah, yeah. No, and I know that Governor Inslee was bringing out all the graphs and stuff not too long ago, trying to say, okay, the nexus is down here. We're going to be at this lower point where COVID is going to be with us. I think that's what we have to get real about here. It's going to be something that's hopefully endemic, not a pandemic here. But just one last coda on this one, if I could, with you, David. Do you think there will be businesses out there? Because businesses will actually be free to impose these different regulations. Hey, show us your card or whatever else, even though the state's backing off of this. I wonder if businesses are going to step up and do that, because as you say, it's a comfort to some people to have that information about who's vaccinated and who's not around them.
Yeah, I imagine, especially in Seattle, I imagine a
Hmm.
lot of restaurants will continue to do that. We should probably caveat that we're taping this on Monday morning,
Right.
and
Hmm.
Monday afternoon we have a press conference from Governor Inslee,
Yeah.
related to. So, as of right now, the statewide mask mandate is scheduled to end, I think,
The
March
21st. Yeah.
21st, maybe.
Hmm.
But it's possible that we'll hear some kind of tweak to that this afternoon.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you for pointing that. And there's a lot still ahead with this. We're trying to cover the news as
Yeah.
best we can here, folks, as it rolls our way. All right. Up next, Seattle's eviction moratorium ends on March 1st. That's another big one here. But that didn't happen without an interesting battle from the Seattle City Council. We're going to break it down on Now Hear This. Following up on a story we've been covering for the last few weeks, Seattle's eviction moratorium is ending on February 28th, so March 1st, those evictions can start happening or go into process. But the Seattle City Council had a resolution sponsored by Councilmember Shama Sawant last week with a plan to extend that moratorium to the end of the declared COVID emergency. Some wrangling went on. The council considered a measure to end the moratorium April 30th, but in the end, it was only a block of 3 council members, Herbold, Sawant, and Mosqueda, who supported the extension, and Council President Deborah Juarez broke it down in last week's meeting on the whole concept of a temporary eviction moratorium.
But the key word is temporary. We knew this moratorium would not last forever. We cannot have a healthy economy when nobody pays rent. With that in mind, in the interim, the City Council's focus has been to create as many protections as possible.
Well, David, we have talked about this eviction moratorium over the past couple weeks here on the podcast, but I was interested in seeing this balance of power on the council with this vote. A split vote isn't all that common for the city council. Councilmember Morales was not in attendance for this meeting on an excused absence. But what did you make of that split? Juarez, Strauss, Peterson, Nelson, and Lewis voting to end the moratorium, Mosqueda, Sawant, and Herbold wanting to extend it. Any thoughts on that part?
Yeah, I mean, it does sort of show some of the shifting politics of the council. I imagine if Morales had been present, she would have voted to extend the moratorium.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and if Lorena Gonzalez was still on the council,
Oh, yeah. Mm-hmm.
she very well could have voted to extend it also. And so
Mm-hmm.
when you've got this we've talked about this before, that the last election didn't like totally fundamentally change the council, because it is still basically a progressive council. But
Mm-hmm.
we knew that those 5-4 votes we used to see might start swinging the other direction, and I think this is an
Yeah.
example of that. A few months ago in October, for example, I
Mm-hmm.
I would wager this probably would have been a 5-4 vote in the other direction to
Right.
extend the moratorium. And so,
Mm-hmm.
and that I think this is probably the first kind of significant example we've seen of how specifically Councilmember Sarah Nelson's presence makes a difference.
Yeah, yeah, it's interesting to see that, and I'm with you. This is a big vote to indicate that kind of shift for the council, possibly. But I wanted to take this a little bit further, because we have touched on how things have been very complicated with King County. Also, now no longer accepting applications for its eviction protection program, and that starts this week too. And from what I have understood here, David, the state's apparently poured 66.5 million more dollars into the county's coffers here, but there are almost 11,000 applications pre-registered here, and the county is saying it might not get to them all. Bigger issue for me here, David, is I think the pandemic has made a lot of things very stark and very clear here, and one of them is a lack of affordable housing in our area. It's a crisis, and even past this temporary aid, the whole idea of trying to end eviction moratoria, etc., we still have this crisis that's with us, and is there a permanent solution? I think is what so many people are asking here, because that part of this is not going away.
Right. I mean, it's almost become cliche at this point to talk about how the pandemic has taken issues that existed before and
Yeah,
exacerbated them. And
yeah.
so, when
Here
you're
we go
talking
again.
about
Yeah.
temporary solutions to pandemic related problems,
Hmm.
usually those problems are not actually purely just pandemic problems. They're, people were struggling with rent and evictions well before the pandemic, but the difference was you had this temporary emergency relief. But as we have talked about many times, policymakers are running into how do you wind down what was supposed to be a temporary solution to a problem that is not temporary at all.
Hmm.
um, so yeah, if someone had a clear answer to that, they'd probably be running this down.
Yeah, no, you would hope, and it it
Yeah.
it is something that I think we're gonna see more details on as we move out of here. But this whole concept of trying to build back better after the pandemic, and this piece of it is the very difficult part. Affordable housing is still a huge issue in our region and will continue to be. But of course, that's an issue we're always going to be tracking here, and we'll see what happens with the evictions as they happen or don't happen in King County over the next couple weeks here. But I wanted to move on to another story that I found very interesting here, David. It's percolating in the Seattle City Council again this week. The quest for equity in the cannabis industry. Councilmember Mosqueda leading this up. So, legal marijuana, a big business in Seattle, 60 stores selling more than $185 million worth of cannabis last year. David, I know your colleague Gene Balk ran some of the numbers here. More people have been using marijuana over the course of the pandemic for sure in counties all across the state. But the problem is this: only 3% of these stores are majority Black owned in the state, and none of the stores in Seattle fit that bill. Sean Kemp has his name on a business downtown, but he only has a 5% stake in it. I've done some work on this on Seattle Channel with this, David. It's a really interesting story. And this is the big concept I'm after here. So, our state legalized marijuana through a public vote 10 years ago, at least in part, so these arrests for simple drug possession would not target people of color, as they overwhelmingly did historically. But then it came to building the industry, and people of color were not part of that picture. How do you reckon with this whole concept here, and how do you fix it? Some thoughts on this?
I think the system was. I mean, we always kind of knew it was a gold rush, going to be a gold rush,
Right.
because unless you were living under a rock, you understood that despite marijuana being illegal, vast sums of people consume marijuana pretty regularly, and so you knew
Hmm.
that the second these stores opened, they would be big money makers, and that is proving to be true.
Hmm.
But the thing about a gold rush is the people who are already more connected and more financed, and kind of have their ducks in a row, are going to be more likely to be able to break onto that scene. And so, of course, that tends to favor people who already have some means,
Yes. Right.
and that often ends up being a wider demographic of people.
Yeah.
And so, I think it is kind of the ultimate painful irony of the
Yeah.
whole legalization. Um, I do think that's why people really glom onto Uncle Ike's on
Hmm.
23rd,
Sure.
because it is the sort of ultimate symbol of a corner where, for decades, mostly Black people
Right.
were being arrested for marijuana, and
Yep.
now there is this large white-owned
Hmm.
marijuana store that's pulling in ungodly amounts of money. So,
Right. Yeah.
um,
Yeah. Six
yeah,
six
it's a
feet
real
away from
concern.
a church up there too, a traditional Black
Right.
church in that neighborhood. Very, very interesting to see it. It's interesting to me, David. I look at this, and I should point out, folks, that there are city council members from Boston, Oakland, and Sacramento here in Seattle this week to discuss the story with the Seattle City Council. So we'll see what they come up with. Apparently, some other cities have come up with some solutions here, but I think this whole quest for equity. It hit a roadblock because a lot of people were involved in the medical side of things, which definitely had some issues before 2012.
Mhm.
But it just feels like they were left out of this. I get the feeling overwhelmingly from this discussion. Do you have some thoughts about that piece of it as we wrap this up?
Yeah, I mean, I actually personally knew somebody who was kind of involved with the
Oh
medical
wow.
side,
Hmm.
and it was not a easy thing to do to kind of switch to make that switch.
Transition. Hmm.
It
Hmm.
really favored, at least my understanding, from talking to this person, is it really the recreational side really favored people coming into the market fresh,
Yeah.
who could kind of put together their bid and their lottery entry and things like that. So
Yeah.
for folks who are already established in the medical world, it was much more onerous to kind of make that switch. Is my understanding.
Right.
I didn't cover it at the time, and I don't have any personal experience with it, but
Right.
that was the sense I got.
Yeah, no, it's an interesting story, and I'm glad Seattle's tackling it because again, this is one of those pieces of the whole legalization discussion that people really weren't thinking about back in 2012. I don't think so. It's been interesting to see how this changes over the years. All right, we're going to move on with a story about a proposed gas tax from the state of Washington that has fueled a pretty big fire between our government and the state of Oregon. We're going to break it down on Transportation Talk. All right. Well, David, you put out a story in the Seattle Times recently about a plan by state Democrats that would impose a tax on fuel exported from our state's 5 refineries. This has had a lot of challenges, including from the Democratic governor of Oregon, Kate Brown, with the throwdown here, telling Governor Inslee to veto this if it came across his desk. Give us the big picture here. What happened with this?
Well, the big picture was Democrats want to go big on transportation, and at the same time, we're trying to do it without raising the gas tax, which is how
Right.
transportation funding has happened in the past. And so, they did a few different things to do that. But one of them was proposed this tax on fuel being exported from Washington State.
hmm
There, which surprisingly, Washington is the 5th largest refiner of fuel products in the state. I mean, in the
hmm
country. So, a lot of fuel is coming out of Washington and going to Oregon, Idaho, Alaska, California to a certain extent. And so, their argument was people in Washington pay 49 cents a gallon in gas tax, but then all this gas that was leaving the state was exempt from that. And so basically what we're doing was we're repealing the exemption on that tax, and we're going to charge 6 cents per gallon. But
Okay.
you, but of course, this is a Washington legislative effort that has impacts on neighboring states,
Sure.
and who have become accustomed to not paying 6 cents per gallon
Yeah. Right.
on fuel taxes or on fuel. And so it really set off this firestorm. I mean, we knew that it was going to face in Republican opposition in Washington State, but
hmm
I think I do think the Democrats genuinely underestimated how strong the response would be from neighboring states. And,
Yeah.
we saw threats of retaliation in Alaska. They
hmm
were threatening to tax fish exports and moorage and
Oh boy.
crude
Okay.
oil exports. And Idaho was making threats that they were going to do whatever necessary to kill this tax. But I do think the real stinger was that first Governor Kate Brown, a Democrat, and then the 2 Democratic leaders in the Oregon legislature both
hmm
came out really strongly against this. And so
Yeah.
suddenly the Democrats in the House and Senate in Washington were looking really lonely.
Yeah.
And so
Right.
I do think it was probably distracting from their larger goal of
Sure.
this $16.8 billion transportation package. And
Yeah,
so
can I jump in on that? I mean, just
sorry, go ahead.
how with that
Yeah.
transportation package, because that's definitely where I wanted to go. Where do we go from here if this tax revenue piece is not a part of that package?
Yeah. So on Saturday, Representative Jake Fye said he was going to introduce an amendment killing this export tax. He is saying he wants to tap this public works account, which is basically this account that exists in the state for local governments to use to build kind of public works projects.
Yeah.
And so what he is proposing is, well, transportation could qualify as a public works project. So we're going to lay claim to $100 million a year from this account for the next 15 years, which would be about $500 million less than their original proposal, but would basically allow them to kind of fulfill their goals, albeit a little bit scaled back.
Mhm.
Republicans in the state legislature don't like that either.
Mhm.
And so the Democrats are still going to get a lot of opposition from Republicans in the state, but maybe they can kind of swallow that, but knowing that they are no longer getting opposition from, say, Democrats in Oregon.
Right. Right.
So
Right.
now their fight is with the people that they're frequently fighting with, which are Republicans, rather than fighting with Oregon legislators who are
Got
threatening
it.
to walk away from, say, the I-5 bridge over the Columbia River,
Right.
which is a big deal.
Yeah, and some known adversaries here for sure. And I guess in looking at this and trying to figure out what comes out of this, I think the Democrats and Republicans almost thought they were on the same page to see a little bit of a state sales tax rollback. I know there was some different bipartisan support for that, and Republicans have been saying, "Hey, we've got the surplus at the state level. Let's get some tax relief." And That apparently has fallen apart. And now we're talking about different taxes, whatever else. This has been such an interesting short session. A lot achieved here, but I wonder if this transportation piece has kind of been left out in the cold. What do you think, David?
Yeah, I don't know that it's been left out in the cold. I do think that 60-day sessions, this is a short 60-day session, and I do think the Democrats are trying to pack in a lot more in a short 60-day session than you would normally see.
Yeah.
Part of that is because they have all this money coming in from the federal government that they need to spend. I do think there's some political considerations that it's an election year and they could lose seats because it's, all polling shows that it could be a tough year for Democrats. So I think they're trying to get as much done as they can before maybe some of their power slips a little bit. So I think part of the reason this has been such an intense session is because they're trying to tackle, all the previous transportation funding measures over the last 20 years all happened in odd year long sessions.
Right.
This would be the first, at least that I know about, that would happen in a short session. And so, it's just kind of it's kind of hot and heavy. It's there's a lot to fight about and a lot to do in not very much time.
Yep. David, to wrap up the show, I wondered if I could touch on it's a sobering topic for sure. It's about what's happening in Ukraine right now. And I've noticed on Twitter you have some friends in Russia. You've kept in touch with them, whatever else. Would you mind sharing a little bit about what you're hearing? It's an awful situation on a global level, and I wondered if you could bring some perspective.
Yeah, I don't want to overstate my perspective, but I did. I lived in Russia for a while. I've spent probably about over a few different stints, about a year in Russia. I speak some Russian. I know a decent number of people in Russia. So, it's been interesting kind of trying to read Russians' reaction to this because, information there is, a lot of it is state run. And so it just was curious if I could glean anything. And, I do think, so I was in Russia when there was a much smaller but kind of invasion into Georgia, and at least when I was there, it was fairly well celebrated among the Russian people that I knew. And my sense also was in 2014 when Russia first annexed Crimea, that also was sort of seen, at least from what I could tell, was being celebrated by a lot of folks in Russia. I am seeing a lot more postings and communication against this one. And I think a lot of that is because, a lot of Russians view Ukraine as, we heard this from Vladimir Putin. A lot of Russians view Ukraine as just basically being part of Russia, which is at this point, incorrect. But at the very least, a lot of people view Ukrainians as being very, very similar to Russians. And so there's a lot of, I think, empathy, and a lot of people have family in Ukraine. And, Kiev was technically the first Russian city in, whatever year 900. And so I wonder, and I don't know for sure, I do wonder that if the notion that Russian soldiers are bombing Kiev, if that will kind of sit poorly with Russians. It's really hard to say, again, because information there is mostly state controlled. So, I don't have any sense of how much kind of good, solid information is actually trickling down to the population. But, I just thought it was interesting that I have been seeing more postings explicitly against this war, which I hadn't seen before in previous conflicts.
Yeah, I know this is a difficult topic, and I appreciate you engaging it, David. And it's something that I know is on everyone's minds in the days that are coming ahead and the weeks that are coming ahead. So I appreciate your thoughts about that one, David. I wanted to thank you for being with me. I wanted to thank everybody who is listening. Thanks especially to our patrons. You are listening to Seattle News, Views, and Brews, where you can always find out what's brewing in local politics. The podcast is on all the major platforms, so please make sure you check it out wherever you might listen. And also make sure you check us out on Converge Media 2 Wednesday nights at 7 o'clock. Thanks. We'll see you next time.
Seattle News, Views, and Brews is an independent production of Callanan Media Services. Copyright 2022.